welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. It's my very great pleasure to introduce Dr. David Carey. David is a reader at Bangor, but I know him from when I was at Aberdeen doing my PhD. And I remember the first time I met him actually was when I was at a departmental research seminar. It was like, you know, the first week I was there or something like that, and there I was kind of sitting there going, oh God, who are all these people and what am I doing here and why have I moved to this grey city and am I doing the right thing? Anyway, so I remember Dave walked right in the room and he clocked that there was myself and a couple of other people there he didn't know, so he went straight over, held out his hand and said, welcome to Aberdeen, it's really nice to meet you. And you know, it was absolutely, I always remember it because it did make me feel very welcome. And indeed, David was always a supportive presence in the department at Aberdeen when I was doing my PhD.
Did you hear that?
So anyway, I'm very pleased to welcome you here today to speak. David did his PhD at Western University in Canada under the supervision of Mel Goodale of Milner and Goodale Model fame, and then went to St Andrews to work with David Milner and was a teaching assistant there before becoming a lecturer and moving to Aberdeen where I met him and just moved to Bangor about 3 years ago, did you say?
Yep.
So that's kind of just a brief biography. His sort of general research interests, sensorimotor control, and I think he'll tell you better than me about the details of that. So I'll just hand over.
Right, thank you very much. I'm sure I must have been drinking in the middle of the day if I came over. It was very welcoming. That doesn't sound like me at all. This kind of stuff, actually, it's sort of an interesting research story in its own end. I'm a clinical neuropsychologist by training, and I did research in visual neuropsychology, but I fell into this work because I've actually become, again, a handedness researcher. And you'll see where some of this came from. It's meant to be a sort of interactive talk, so feel free to interrupt me. And I've kept it kind of light and fluffy around the edges. Football players in particular, anybody play the great game, even part-time casually, they tend to be the biggest skeptics about this research completely, because I'm going to tell you some things that might not jive with what you think about your preferred and non-preferred foot. And that's the plan. This lady, anybody recognize her? I've forgotten her name. She was the second place goal in the FIFA Goal of the Year this year. If you Google FIFA Goal of the Year, the goal she scored recorded on somebody's handheld phones. Absolutely fantastic. She should have won. Anyway, I'm not going to tell you too much about women's football. I meant to tell you much more, but there's a particular neuropsychological reason why I'm interested in women compared to men in that regard. Anyway, the plan today is to talk to you a little bit about right-sidedness in general and why that's of some interest if you're interested in brain behavior. And we'll talk about evidence, and my stall is well out there, that footedness is biological and that what can be learned in terms of foot skills in sports like soccer is actually pretty restricted in one domain. Then we'll talk a little bit about what got me doing the research in the first place, which goes back to the 1990s and the fact that Graham Lasso, the English left back, was injured. And so there are lots and lots of stories about how we can't produce good left-footed players in this country, unlike those pesky insert bugbear country, Germans, Brazilians, Argentinians, you know, etc. So the real question of some of the data I'll show you today is how one-footed are these elite players, people who had a really vested interest in learning to become very skilled with both feet. And then I'll talk to you about our two new studies. The one has to do with the same sorts of questions in the women's elite game, which has been facilitated by networks like BBC showing the women's game now on TV. It's been a real boon for us. And I'll also talk very briefly about something that's not complete yet, but this notion that your handedness for something like writing is actually related to how one-footed you are for kicking a football on the pitch. So that's the plan. The starting point for all this, and it's actually a research area that's fallen a bit out of favor in cognitive neuroscience in the last 10 or 20 years for various reasons, that's another talk, is that we're extremely right-sided species, right? So if you ask any kind of sample in any country in the world about preference for skilled activities like writing or throwing a ball or eating soup with a spoon, most of us are right-handed, about 90%, and about 10% are left-handed. We're also, though, we show this right foot preference, which is quite surprising if you think about the fact that we're bipeds, and that, in fact, ever since we can walk at a very young age, you're doing some pretty complicated motor control things with both your feet all the time, but yeah, we still have a strong foot preference for things. Most of those items you're not particularly one-footed for, but things like kicking are a good example that we'll talk more about today, obviously. You're also right-eyed as a group. If I force you to use one eye, for example, to align with a distant target, again, the right side bias is not quite so dramatic here, about 65–70%. So there's some kind of relationship between these things, and if you're a neuropsychologist, you wonder if this is coincidence you can flip a coin 3 times and get 3 heads or 3 tails, or if they're related in some fashion. And I would like to believe that they are related to the fact that there's something special about the left hemisphere and motor control for both sides of the body. So, and you can approach this from all kinds of different domains. I tend to be a little loose in this version of the talk about talking about speech and language as if they're synonymous, but for our purposes, think of them as overlapping. The substrates in your brain that are important for producing speech overlap with the substrates in your brain that are important for comprehending speech and making sense of the speech signal. So, you know, even in messy data like fMRI, you can look at individual people, and although some people look sort of bilateral, and you always see bilateral activation depending upon what your subtraction technique is, even in imaging, you see left hemisphere dominance for any kind of language task you'd like, or now, our techniques are getting good at, you can look at carefully made speech movements in the magnet as well. So, in right-handers, we've known for a long time, long before we had fMRI, the left hemisphere is more important for speech than the right hemisphere. And you know that from incidences of aphasia. So back, I think of Paul Broca, Carl Wernicke, back in the 1870s, we know that aphasia was much more likely to happen if you're a right-hander after left hemisphere damage than right. And in fact, we assumed lefties were the other way around, but that turns out to be wrong. About 70% of lefties, do we have any adextrals in the audience, left-handed for writing? You guys, look, they sit close to each other. They hang out together. It's amazing. Anyway, if you come to Bangor, because you're rare and you're very valuable, we know Daniel very well, actually, in Bangor. The majority of you, paradoxically, have left hemisphere dominant for speech. And then the question is, why the heck aren't you right-handed? But a number of you are interesting because you're atypical in the sense that you're either right hemisphere dominant or bilateral. But that's another talk also. What some of us believe is that in right-handers at least, it's not a coincidence that my left hemisphere is good at controlling muscles during speech, but it also happens to be the hand that I favor when I first pick up a crayon when I'm a little boy and start to do my first semi-skilled tasks. So left-handers are a bit of a mystery in this regard, but that's our kind of approach. And it's really based upon simple anatomy, and this anatomy has nothing to do with your handedness, it just has to do with the way the motor and sensorimotor cortex talk to your hands, and that for the distal muscles, the muscles of your fingers and your hands in particular, we're pretty contralateral in terms of organization. So when I wiggle the fingers of my right hand, in some sense, those marching motors are coming from motor and premotor cortex of my left hemisphere. And of course, the somatosensory feedback from skin, from muscles and joints is also largely contralateral, at least vis-a-vis primary somatosensory cortex. So maybe that's why many of us are right-sided. But this leaves a mystery of you adextrals, many of whom seem to have brains well suited for right-handedness. So what about footedness? Actually, ridiculously understudied for all kinds of reasons, and I'm not sure what all those reasons are. I think a big part of it is not perfectly correlated with handedness. So the right-handers in the audience, how many of you would prefer to kick a football with your left hand, left foot, sorry? Any left footers in here? Rare. Left-handers, what would you kick? Which foot? Left foot? Which foot would you kick a ball with?
Right.
Right. Okay, you're rare. But there's not a perfect relationship, and so people thought, well, if they're not perfectly related, hands are the sexy things. Hands are the things that are all about tool use in Homo habilis or Australopithecus and so on. Who cares about feet? Feet are not so interesting. And surely, footedness is learned, right? You learn to kick a ball or something like that. So you could argue, though, not so much now, not so much even since about the end of World War II, there's been a big bias against being left-sided in most cultures, right? If your mom saw you, or your teacher in school, or the nun in Catholic school saw you playing with that crayon with your left hand, you can be sure it would be removed, or you might even receive a forceful little slap. Can you think of a time when there was a bias about being left-footed somehow, that you would notice, aha, you're a little boy kicking a football with this left foot and you can run to stop him? Of course not. So there probably isn't as much right-sided world bias towards foot than hand. So I think that's of some interest. You can go further with that kind of argument, and you could say, look, Helen is a football-savvy mom. Her favorite team is whoever it is, and her little boy is just starting to kick a ball, and she's dreaming of him being the winger for Liverpool or somebody one day. If he kicks that ball with his left foot, he's rare. He's going to get more time playing on his team when he's little, etc. And there might be selection biases, which mean he's also rare in terms of once he develops the skills and can dribble and so on, he's rare for opponents, right? So there should be some selection biases for left-footers, perhaps, or two-footed players, you could argue. Yeah? So if anything, the argument I'm making here is that there's probably no bias against being left-footed. If anything, there should be a bias towards producing kids who are left-footed for kicking a ball, insofar as you can learn it. And the last thing I'll mention, just briefly, but we might talk about later, and this may be connected to this right world bias problem, but I think only partially, is that only a few studies have very indirectly looked at whether or not your footedness is related to cerebral dominance for things like language. So imagine I do a study where I get a group of people like you. You're left-handed. I'm pointing to a lady in the audience for our studio, for our at-home audience. If you're a left-handed person who's right-footed, I can make a group of people who are crossed for hand and foot. I can compare you to a bunch of left-handed, left-footed people. I can compare you to the cheapest chips right-footed, right-handed people. But if I can find some left-footed, right-handed people, this is hard to say, then I have four cells of a design. And what I can do is do two independent, semi-independent contrasts. I can contrast the left-footers and the right-footers versus the left-handers and the right-handers. And I'm not the first person, and in fact, I've not really done this. I've done this with some data just for fun recently. So the gold standard, back in the old days, when you couldn't put people in a magnet, is to use an indirect perceptual task like dichotic listening, where you play two different syllables simultaneously to each ear. So ba to the left ear, ga to the right ear. And under these conditions, we think the ipsilateral pathway is largely suppressed. So unlike vision, the auditory system is not completely crossed. But there's good reason to believe that under dichotic listening conditions, you get something that's crossed. And what happens is, of course, if it's a speech syllable like ga, most right-handers, the majority, not a huge majority, tend to report more syllables that were played to the right ear than to the left. And that, of course, is because we think their left hemisphere is dominant for speech sounds. So there's the experiment, and here's the result. And this has been done a couple of times, but no one pays attention to it. What's plotted here is ear advantage. So all you need to know about this scale is this means more right-eared. So in other words, left hemisphere dominant for speech. This means more left-eared. Remember, these guys are rare. They're going to be quite rare in any random sample. And what my colleague Lauren Elias did was compare people. So it's hand then foot. So these are the left people, like Daniel and this gentleman here. These are the right-left people, me, the only one in this audience. The left-right people, that's left-handed, right-footed. Do we have any of those? You. And then right, the rest of you. And you see this nice kind of linear relationship, right? It's messy, and it's at mean level, but they're not the only group to claim this. Here's a paper published a couple of years earlier by Peter McNeilich and colleagues. And again, the score doesn't get below 0 here. These are averages across the number of people, but you get this nice linear progression. So for a laugh, just for poor Dan Roberts, who's seen some of these other data before, Leah Johnstone, my PhD student, and I cobbled together some of our own data. And it's the same sort of story. It's not ridiculously clear. We've got pretty good sample sizes here, but we've ordered it the same way. So in a sense, what you're looking at here are the left-footed people, and here are the right-footed people. I'm one of the 3 people in this cell, because sadly, left-footed right-handers are hard to find. So I'm going to recruit some active ones for other purposes, but we'll see. But this works. So this is all suggesting to me there's something kind of interesting about footedness.
What do you use, so thinking of the kind of scale you use to find out about handedness, and what hand you use to prove? What are your questions?
The reality is we use a 15-item questionnaire that's not hugely different from the Edinburgh Handedness Inventory or anything else. There are some reasons we can talk about this, that in a sense, for some of our other experiments, we just classify people dichotomously by writing hand. Handedness researchers tied themselves in knots in the 80s and 90s about, well, should we use a 40-item battery, a 20-item battery? Should we have somebody tapping a telegraph key as fast as they can, or moving pegs from one, this all changes and
What's your foot measure? So your foot measure is similar, self-reported.
This one is self-report. We do use a footedness battery, although a lot of the items are weak.
Yeah.
And footedness, and not surprising, we're bipeds, that we have a foot. So you ask people about which foot you'd use to step up on our chair. If you're on the beach and you're writing your name in the sand, which toe would you use? You're scrubbing out something slanderous that somebody else has written about you in the sand. Which foot do you use? Which foot do you step on a shovel with, and so on. Kicking works fine. Ask somebody which foot they used to kick a ball. The only problem you have are football players. Because you guys all think you're two-footed. So I decided some years ago to go with forced choice. So if Ralph says to me, use either foot, I say, Ralph, you're facing the Germans in the World Cup. You're taking a penalty and you're putting them out. Which is it going to be?
Doesn't matter, does it?
Of course it is. It's another dog. I have had 14 amateur players actually tell me that they use either foot to take a penalty, which clearly means they've never taken a penalty for a serious team in their life. Of course you have a favorite foot if I force you to. Right, okay. So, Is footedness related to handedness? Well, in some sense, they are. Look at all the right-handed right-footers in this room. I mean, there's a relationship. So you can't see this, and I apologize. This is from really strongly right-handed people, all the way to really strongly left-handed people here. And this is the percent of people who are either left-footed or mixed-footed. Now, this is, I would never do this on a questionnaire, but if you give people the opportunity to say, I use either foot, some people do. And there's a huge relationship, but it's not perfect. So if you're quite a strong right-hander, which most of us are on any kind of questionnaire, most of us endorse most items, the chances of being right-footed are about 95, 96%. If you're a strong left-hander, your chances of being mixed or left-footed is about 85%. So again, it's not perfectly related, but you have two dichotomous measures, not surprising. So the trick is, I'm telling you here, that footedness is related in some way to cerebral dominance, although imperfectly. It's related to handedness almost perfectly, but not quite perfectly. But surely footedness is learned. Surely there are huge environmental, sociological conditions that determine which foot you use, and that's what everybody believes, right? Maybe football players can teach themselves to use either foot, or you could even mold your son or daughter into one of those rare left footers who's going to get a lot of time. So this is the Graham Lasso story. There are loads of studies like this at the time. And I was in Aberdeen, relatively new to Scotland, and I was getting quite excited about football, world's greatest game. Gave up on ice hockey, that was the one I used to support. And I watched a lot of games, and I thought, is this really true? Are the world's greatest players really quite two-footed, or they're interesting? So there was some research on this, but it's funny research that's hard to interpret. So one of the easy things you can do, because we're all stats mad, is you can count the number of goals in a tournament or a season or something like this. And I may come back to this at the end of the talk just for a bit of fun. But you know, various people show that most of the goals are scored in a tournament or a league in any given year with the right foot, but that's meaningless because you don't know how many of those goals are scored by people who use their right foot all the time or their right foot 60% of the time, etc. I can say with great confidence that I'm one of the top 3 footedness and football researchers in the world, because there's only 3 of us doing it. I could be number 2 or number 1 even. This is one of the other guys, and he does it using questionnaire. So he found a bunch of Greek professional players, and he gave them questions, but they weren't questions about football. They were questions about which foot would you step on a chair, which foot would you use to smooth sand, and so on. Or maybe that's football items too, it doesn't really matter. And the professionals were all saying, I'm two-footed. Then he went to a group of semi-professionals, and about 30% of them were claiming to be mixed-footed. Only 12%, 13% of the amateurs, and non-sporting sample, about 10% mixed-footed. So wow, there's your evidence. Clearly, either there are selection biases for you to get to the top level of the National League, you have to be pretty two-footed, or those guys learn to be two-footed as a consequence of playing so much football or something like this. So, you know, the amateurs are less two-footed than semi-professionals who are less than professionals. But this is by questionnaire, and this is just wrong. It's just wrong, in my opinion. What do players actually do on the pitch? I mean, that's the key question here. And the methods are ridiculously simple and reasonably reliable. You just watch them. You videotape games, and you quantify what they actually do for different kinds of activities. And then what you can do, of course, once you collect enough data, which takes a very long time, you can classify them dichotomously based on which foot they use more. And you can say, how many of these lefties are out there, left-footers, right? Or there are lots of two-footed players, for example. And the implication there would be practice somehow, or selection bias makes some players more left-footed, or maybe right-footedness isn't so interesting, etc. So you see where I'm going with this, right? What would make a two-player two-footed anyway? And that's become a more interesting kind of question. Equivalent use of both feet, right? If you're two-footed, why wouldn't you use them both? The affordances to use for the left foot or the right foot on a pitch should be over many games and many players about the same, shouldn't it? It's an adversarial pitch. My team is playing your team. You're coming this way. We're going that way. We can all play down one side. It's a very unusual looking game. Notational analyses show you the way the game is organized and so on. So, you know, maybe equivalent success. Maybe that's what training does for you. It makes you quite skilled with that foot, but you might not use it as much. And that's where we're going, really. So these are a couple of papers that I published about it. We started out with some matches from the English Premiership, and this tells you how long I've been doing this. Back in 97, 98, and also we analyzed some matches from the World Cup in France. And I've got so much of this data, I don't really know what to do with it, quite frankly. And it keeps telling me the same story, so that's why I haven't really progressed very far. We've classified at least 75,000 actions. Right, there's a bunch of us watching, and it sounds great. I'm going to watch football. and get paid for it. But it's really not like that at all, because you have to watch something in slow motion. When somebody goes on a mazy, when Lionel Messi gets the ball and does something so quickly, you watch it again and again, and two of you rate it and have to agree on which foot he used and what he did and what the outcome was. We classify the behaviors as passes, first touches, tackles, dribbles, shots, set pieces, and clearances. Okay, we have definitions for all these things. We also categorize them, and again, this is a crude way to do it, but over 75,000 actions, we're probably in the ballpark, which is a pass is a success if the ball's next touched by a teammate. Now what that means, of course, is sometimes your favorite player will hit the most elegant, beautiful pass ever, a defender makes an extraordinarily athletic thing and intercepts it, your teammate falls over, we call that a failure. And you think, well, that's not fair. But you take the fan out of the loop here, because of course we're all football fans. When you're watching your own team, you're going to be biased. That was a beautiful pass. You also occasionally see activities where the player will shank the ball completely. It fortuitously drops to a teammate. If you're 90% sure that was not what the first player intended, you'd call it a success. But who could argue that over hundreds and hundreds or thousands and thousands of passes, good ones get your teammates, right? Your teammate might muck it up. But if that ball's next touched by a person on the same team, that's a success. And so on for tackles and everything else. It's fairly reliable. But anyway, this is the story. So what I've plotted here is number of players. So you code that many players and you can actually do real distribution work. I've coded a number of players along this axis and percentage right along this axis. So really right-footed people. Right now, these will be people at 100% right-footed will be people we didn't classify very many actions from. If you classify enough actions, every player occasionally uses his non-preferred foot. And these are left-foot players here. And what's really obvious is you have a nice bimodal distribution. And this is the kind of equal use range here, and how many players are actually using their foot, both feet, when they're playing. At that elite level, right? Players playing in the Premiership, playing for their national teams. The answer is nobody. I mean, a tiny number of players. Tiny, tiny. If you split this distribution in two, what you get is 80% of the guys are right-footed and 20% are left-footed, which is exactly what it is in the rest of us. Exactly what I'd predict. Okay? So this was, we really didn't anticipate this. We really expected to see much. We thought we might even see a trimodal distribution. You know, do you have a little player, a little lump of elite players who really have mastered this problem? Or maybe it's irrelevant. Maybe having to use both feet when you're Lionel Messi is not important at all. If he came here for a kickabout, Ralph, would he be on your team even though he's pretty one-footed? Of course he would. It's not that important. Just to show you, by the way, that data includes everybody we ever coded, and that sometimes would be a substitute who came on and maybe touched the ball 10 times. So what I've done now, I'm sorry if you can't read this, this is a mean of 0.7. So the average of all these players is about 70% of the time, 70% of their actions were with the right foot. It's cluster sort of thing. And I've just made an animation where I increased the criteria for how many actions you have to be included. Because we haven't yet done the maths of how many actions do you really want to collect from one player to know exactly how right-footed or left-footed he or she is. And as you increase the number, you guys can't make this up, but this mean stays at 0.70. The distribution stays exactly the same. It just shrinks. And why that is we don't have not many actions from somebody because she's right-footed or he's left-footed. We have not many actions from them because they were sub or they weren't in a game that we coded. So the mean stays absolutely the same. So it suggests that you just want to know what the distribution looks like. You don't need very many actions. Right? If you want to classify a player also, just crudely as right-footed or left-handed, you don't need many actions at all. If you want to know exactly how right-footed they are, that's a different story. Okay. Are the estimates reliable from game to game? So, and loads of people tell me this when you play, right, Ralph? You're short in defense, and so you've got to play right back, whereas your preferred position is in the central midfield, and suddenly you're playing out on the wing a lot, so you're doing a lot with your right foot, where you wouldn't do so much with your left foot, right? Well, actually, we did this a long time ago. I need to do it with a much larger sample size. I got some players for whom I had 2 games. Game 1, and each data point is the percentage of right foot actions from that player, and this is his these are all men. This is his percentage in game 1, and this is his percentage in game 2, and there's the unity line. And a huge problem you have when you do this kind of stuff is if you have lefties and righties in any sample, you sometimes get correlations because there'll be a big cloud of dust down here and a big cloud of dust up here. So I did the correlation over in just the right-footed players, and it's 0.8. I mean, and we don't even have that many actions from these particular players. There's one outlier, Brazilian player. I can't remember what was going on there. The other very odd one was David Beckham, and I can't remember the tournament, but the famous tournament where he broke his metatarsal, and I think it was in his dominant foot, so they planted him out on the left side or something. So he's less, in that instance, David Beckham, an elite player at that time, he was capable of using his left foot, right? But he had a broken right foot. Probably not your best data point. So pretty reliable for the most part. I have more data on that now. The other odd thing, and again, I'm not sure if you guys can see this, I apologize. What I've done here is I've put the players into two groups, right footers and left footers, and I've calculated how one-footed are they for first touch versus kicking the ball out of the danger area versus dribbling versus passing versus taking a set piece, right, a dead ball, a free kick, a penalty kick, or corner kick, taking a shot, or tackling another player. What's really quite remarkable is that if you look at the right footers only, this is about 71%, 71%, 86%, 85%, 86%, 72%, 71%. I mean, really quite surprising. This is not our whole sample. I have to redo this. Now, in the lefties, it's not quite so clear, and for a couple of the categories, but I don't have very many left-footed players, right, even with that big sample. They look perhaps less left-footed for a couple of these categories, but not by much here, about 5% here. They look a little less left-footed than right-footers look right-footed. Now that's important neuropsychologically, in a weird sense, because whenever you test a group of left-handers versus a group of right-handers on anything that's vaguely related to brain, speech and language, face processing, whatever, the asymmetries are always weaker in the left-sided group. And the assumption there is because some of the lefties go the wrong way. Some of the lefties in that sample, you don't know which ones. They're unusual, they're rare, they have reverse dominance, let's say, or atypical dominance. So I need to follow up on that. But it's also kind of odd that in the right footers at least, where I have a fair number of players even back at this analysis, these biases are either about 70% right-footed or about 85% right-footed. And it's not higher for set piece, and I suspect that's because in actual gameplay, you see a lot of set pieces where it's a free kick and the ball's just kicked quickly. And so under circumstances like that, perhaps, when the demands are not very high, I take a quick free kick with my non-preferred foot. If I separate out corner kicks, penalty kicks, that would be a different story. Because of course, strategically, if this particular situation requires a left-footed action, and I'm a right footer, I wouldn't take it. The left footer on the pitch would come over. And there's always, in a team of 11, always one or two left-footers on the pitch. Of all the games I've seen one, Brazil, 3 left-footers on out of 11 players once. I've only seen one team ever, of all the games I've watched now, recorded, but they had 0 left-footers. It was England. Everybody on the pitch was right-footed. Very amusing. Anyway, sorry. Left-footers do look maybe somewhat less one-footed, but again, back then this was 329 right-footers and only 100 left-footers. I have more data now to speak to this, but I'll have to have a look at that. Or relatively two-footed players more successful. So if you remember, we've got a score of success failure, and it's a messy measure by all accounts. But this is success rate, so 100% up here, right? And there are a few players that are 100% who we didn't see many actions for, and they weren't very demanding actions probably. And Dan Smith did this for me. Deviation from right-footed, I don't know. This would be the two-footed players in here. So this big cloud are the right-footed players, and this cloud is the left-footed players at that analysis. And there's just no relationship between how one-footed you are and what your average success rate was like. Now, it's a messy measure, and we can talk about that. But I think this is kind of surprising. And a related phenomenon, again, I don't want to... I'll skip this part. A related phenomenon is, of course, you can, once you get enough actions, because non-preferred foot actions are relatively rare, right? A right-footed player is about 70% right-footed, or 75% right-footed, actually. So he or she doesn't use their left foot very often, but you can over time collect enough data. What you can do is you can estimate how successful are they when they actually get around to using their rotten foot. So they don't do it very often. So for this analysis, I think I said you had to see at least 10 passes from the bad foot in a player to include them. And we have 52 right-footed players who made this criteria for passing. And this is percent success again. So up here is 100% successful. The dark bar is the preferred foot, so for the right footers, the right foot. And the lighter bar is the non-preferred foot. And there's just no difference in right footers or left footers. In fact, if anything, in the left footers, it's going slightly in the wrong direction. Now, it's a crude measure of success, there's no question. I have no doubt, Ralph, if I go out into the lab, and I measured accuracy using a laser board, and I measured peak, torque at your knee, and so on, I find some subtle differences between your preferred and non-preferred foot. But at the level of these guys, the very elite players, when they do stuff with that bad foot, the outcomes are pretty good usually. And this produces very polarized opinion amongst football players. They say, bollocks, they say, Carey, have you never played the world's greatest game? Of course I'm bad with my bad foot. That may be true, that I'm bad with both feet actually.
You must compensate for it as well to some extent, because other options make it faster. You know you're going to have to make on your left foot, may well way up, whether to make it faster or not. So that's presumably going to help to flatten.
Well, several things I think are going on. Ralph's comment is, well, under conditions where it's necessary for you to use your non-preferred foot, who knows? You might concentrate harder, all kinds of things could happen. The complaints I've had from referees go in opposite directions. So some referees will say, well, this is trivial. You only use your bad foot when it's easy. So imagine the Arsenal of old, Tony Adams stroking the ball delicately across the pitch with his left foot to Lee Dixon, who has all the time in the world and takes it with his left foot and then strokes it back with his right foot back to Tony Adams. But in fact, and we try to come up with a way to measure this, and it's impossible, the clinical impression is that actually most of these players, even elite players, use their bad foot when they have to. And when they have to, it usually means conditions are constrained. They're being closed down. And how many times in a game do you see it where a player squanders an opportunity to do something, like a shot, that's when it's most obvious, but it happens all over the pitch, where you squander an opportunity to do something with your bad foot, you use your good foot, and you duff it, and then everybody notices. But then as fans and as pundits, we make attribution errors. So when Ryan Giggs, left footer, would whack the ball over the bar with his right foot, the commentator would say, well, he couldn't get it onto his preferred foot, that was terrible. Ryan Giggs also whacked the ball over the bar with his left foot quite a bit. But you don't say that's because he used his dominant foot. You say his head was up, or the ball bobbled, or something else. Right? So all that kind of stuff is fans. You have to be careful about. Okay, so as a group, the professional players, as far as I can tell, and this hasn't changed, we've added data to this, are consistently one-footed for a range of different actions on the pitch, right? And it's not just for skilled actions, however you want to define them, versus unskilled actions. Yet amateurs, and I'm not showing you that data today, that's what they tell you. They say, for skilled things, I'm really right-footed. But for less skilled things, oh, I'm pretty two-footed. And it just maps beautifully. You say, how often do you use your right foot for making a long pass? And players report something. How often do you use your right foot for making a short pass? They'll say, oh, much less, unless it's right-footed. This is what players tell you, and I don't think they're right. Unless the amateurs are doing something very different than professionals, which is possible. And I don't think, as weak as my measure of skill is, that you can explain in these elite players that why they're one-footed is because their bad foot is so atrocious. And it's also not psychological. The other thing I got when this got a bit of press a few years ago was that, well, players are malingering somehow, you know, they're being weak. They should be tougher. They should know that their bad foot is good. It's all psychological stuff. There's no way. On the pitch, even playing as an amateur, you're not making those kinds of decisions at the time. You make decisions after the fact when you duff something up, or you score a goal with your bad foot, you show your mates, don't you? Look at that. Do you see that? Score that with my good one. So there's all kinds of attributions you do after the fact. But the decision making you make on the pitch is not, which foot should I use this time? It just doesn't work that way. So I will eventually look at these 70 and 85% clusters for the different football actions in a much bigger sample. And the left footers, it's going to be really interesting when that happens. I don't have a great explanation for these things. They might be strategic in some sense and related to the demands of those types of actions or something else, I'm not sure. You know, these non-significant differences in outcome for good and bad foot, you know, we need more data on individual players. We need a lot of them. And we can also model that in some bootstrapping kind of way once by doing more detailed analysis of individual players, but also bring more players into the sample. You know, and our left footers more two-footed than right footers. They should be in some weird neuropsychological sense, but I don't think they're going to turn out to be, which is a mystery from a brain asymmetry point. And then there are all kinds of sources of noise that are incredible. You know, where you play on the pitch makes a huge difference. If you're playing down the right wing or you're playing on the left side. So in a weird sense, this makes it an unfair playing field because when you see 2 or 3 left-footed players out of 11 on the pitch, they usually are in the same place. They're the left back, right? Usually left footer. Sometimes the left central. Sometimes left midfield. Occasionally a striker. Occasionally a keeper, right? Well, I should be comparing those players with players in equivalent positions on the right, and then to see what will happen. But it's too much work. You to go back and find out where everybody was playing in all the games that we've coded now. Does a player's handedness matter? And that's what I'm going to talk to for the last 5 or so minutes, and I'm going to say something very quick about women. Right, so what about women? So, a few years ago, I'd stopped doing this stuff for a while and got back to my day job, and BBC started broadcasting the women's game. And around that time, I was talking to a couple of students about a huge asymmetry in asymmetries, if you will, which is left-handed women are rarer than left-handed men. It's not a huge difference. In men, you're about 12% or so of the population, maybe 13, depending upon the culture, 7 or 8 in women. Consistent. It's there forever. And nobody understands why that's the case. So these are my colleagues in Bergen, Renee Westerhausen and Marco Hernstein, who I talked to doing this research with me. And what we've been doing is just doing the analysis on the professional women's game. We haven't gotten that far yet. But why do we care? Well, there's the sex difference in handedness between the two, and nobody knows why it's there. So there are biological theories that have to do with perinatal testosterone, which affects baby girls just like baby boys, not in the same concentrations and so on, and left hemisphere growth. And everybody's poo-pooed these ideas, although they mostly poo-pooed them in the pathological left-hander kind of context. You all have immune disorders and you die young. The argument I came across more recently, which really kind of shocked me, was that this is a kind of sociological learning difference. It's that when Anna, in fact, is a natural left-hander, but when Mom came along and said, "No, Anna, no, bad girl," Anna loves her mommy and was compliant. Whereas Daniel was a bad boy. He didn't give a monkey's what his mom said, and he was going to keep riding with that crayon no matter what. Anybody told him. And when he went to Catholic school and they tied his hand behind, he rebelled because he's a man. How does this idea sound? Does it sound plausible? Well, look, how would you study it? I'll take your children. We'll tie one hand behind them. You can't do experiments, can you? But what about left-sidedness in football? So remember what I argued before? If anything, you're agnostic about it. You don't pay any attention at all to your child's foot preference, unless somehow you're a football mad mom or dad or something. I did find this one paper by an Indian psychologist who claims, well, there's huge rightward bias on hand and foot. And he says, the right foot is also used infrequently in many unipedal activities and for certain auspicious occasions. In India, a woman enters the home of her husband for the first time following marriage by stroking a pot of paddy with her right foot. I don't know how often they're getting married in India. Maybe they do this regularly. They stroke the pot of paddy. I don't know what that is. This is the only example I've ever come across of anybody complaining there'd be a bias against left foot. So I don't think there's much evidence for it. Or at least it's dwarfed compared to the evidence against being left-handed. So here's the story. Here's the data from the men. And I'll give you the same distribution. The mean percentage right. So you calculate a percentage right for each player. That's this score along here. Of all their touches, how many were from the right foot. And it's 0.7 over everybody. And then if you classify somebody's right-footed or left-footed by greater than 50% less, you get 80% of the blokes are right-footed and 20% are left-footed. We got 1.1%, must be 2 players or something, who were 50-50. We just don't have enough data. So what happens with the women? What happens with the women is monstrous difference. Might not look it when you look at the distributions. Again, the mean, which isn't the interesting measure here, it's a little bit higher. 87.5% of these women are right-footed. They use their right foot more than their left. These are all elite players playing for their national team. These are ladies who played in the Olympics or in the last World Cup. 11% left-footed compared to 10% difference. Monstrous difference. Absolute monstrous. So again, and in the direction that you would expect. Now, handedness and footedness aren't perfectly related. It could be 2 flips of the coin, 2 tails rather than 2 heads. It's possible, but I think this is quite interesting. I've got more data now. I haven't analyzed it. Right, and last thing I'm just going to mention really quickly. There is a sort of relationship between handedness and footedness, right? If you're right-handed, you're pretty likely to be right-footed. But what's a tougher prediction is that, well, what if I look at players who have concurrent handedness? So I can't give David Beckham a 15-item handedness questionnaire. He won't answer my emails. But I can tell you which hand he writes with. And I can do that for Lionel Messi, and I can do that for a lot of other professional athletes. I pick on Graham Lasso. Nobody remembers Graham Lasso anymore, except for me. But that left-handed left-footer. Lucas Podolski, Arsenal player, right-handed but left-footed, right? So he's crossed, he's incongruent. And here's Frank Ribery, left-handed, right-footed, who I think is rubbish, by the way. I just thought I'd get that in. I put that in first when he was playing in the Champions League. At some time I was giving this talk. It drives me nuts. Anyway, sorry, so that's the story. So it hasn't worked so far. It's working in the sort of direction. And if it worked, it would be a miracle, to be honest with you. But because you're underpowered, it's hard to find some of these characters, right? So a gold bar means congruent. Your hand preference and foot preference are on the same side. So these are the David Beckhams. I have millions of them. In fact, I have more than this. These are the, I forget who's who now. These are, of course, right-footed players who are left-handed. And the trend is in the correct direction here. The trend is in the correct direction here, but I'm underpowered. And you can see what the variability looks like in all these instances, of course, except for the right-footers, because I have so many of them. So I'll get more. Why this takes forever is you have to find pictures of players signing autographs. Do you know how many times I've seen Christian Bale or Ronaldo? Jesus, that man is everywhere. I know your hands already, guys. It's those players for Turkey in the last World Cup that I'm after. So it takes time to do this kind of analysis. I'll do more of it. But that will be astonishing. If I can get these cells up to a reasonable number, why would somebody's handwriting have anything to do with how one-footed they are? And again, in a dream world, you have a lot more control. You look at what positions they were on the pitch and so on. So I think I'm almost done. Our left footers are strongly lateralized as right footers. You never find that in handedness. Unless somehow, footedness perfectly is related to brain asymmetry. Right? All those left footers are right brain dominant for speech, language, and motor control, which is not the case. We know that's not the case. Or even the dichotic listening data would be totally different. So there are some interesting things to be found up there. And I'm grappling with this right now because I'm doing a bunch of other things on handedness, but I wanted to talk to you guys about because I'm here about footedness. And we're beginning to think we should be desperately recruiting left-footed people, not left-handed people, for the studies that we're doing on differences in motor control in the hands, but also difference in cerebral symmetry. So at Bangor, we have a magnetic resonance imaging facility, and so we're starting to scan people, looking for people with unusual patterns of cerebral dominance for speech, but also for face processing, for example. And I'm beginning to think maybe I should be recruiting left-footers, not left-handers. Most of them have funny right-handed brains, but some don't. So you're 3 times more likely to find a right brain dominant person amongst the left-handers. You're still not very likely to find it, though. That's what we're discovering. These crossed asymmetries too are kind of funny. All of the neuropsych discussion for 120 years has been about handedness. So what's going on when you're left-footed and right-handed? And some of the variance is chance. Some of the variance is education. Some of the variance is morphological and so on. And accent. That's certainly going to be true. Right, just the last, can I say one last thing or should I stop? One last thing? I just want to say, there's all kinds of stuff in the media out here. I keep getting dragged back to this because people say crazy things. You get overpaid by almost 19% if you're two-footed. Some economist at Leicester somewhere published this one a while ago. I thought, oh my God. First of all, who has all this data on people's footedness? So they got all this from transfermarket.de, which if you're football daft, is this website where they stock players and they rate them and so on. And I said, well, they have footedness? They'll have footedness on thousands of players. I'll never have to watch another game in slow motion for the rest of my life. But, and here's what they say. I go, oh my God, this is not what my data says. 60% of players are right-footed, 22% are left-footed, and they say only 18% of players are equally strong at both feet. And I go, only 18%? I'm seeing like 3%. What is going on? And what's going on is they're not counting. They're having external experts assess players' footedness. And so what do those external experts use to decide that Lionel Messi's two-footed but Ronaldo's not? And the answer is I have no idea. But it's not, they're sure not counting what these people do, that's for sure. Anyway, the other one I just wanted to show you was this is a guy named Jamie Jackson. I'm sorry you can't read this. He's a sports columnist for The Guardian, and he called me. I haven't done this stuff for years, but he called me about this. This was a couple of years ago. Because he was all excited about how many goals were being scored by left-footers or by the left foot in the English Premier League. This is 2 seasons ago, I guess. And you can't read this, I'm sorry, but what he says is, wow, so far this season, the 110 goals with the other boot account for 30.9% of the 356 scored so far, which is higher than last year's mark, a total of 303 or 28.5. Well, firstly, 28.5% versus 30.9%. I wouldn't get very excited about. My stats aren't that good, but that's probably not a significant proportional difference. But anyway, I just thought, here's my mathematical thinking about this, which is probably grossly oversimplified. Look, for shooting, left footers and right footers are about 70% one-footed, right? Let's forget about headed goals. They don't count anyway. We're about goals that are scored with the foot. Left-footed goals, 80% of all the players, the right footers, score 30% of goals with their non-dominant left foot. So I'm assuming there's no differences in skills somehow, that the world's elite or left-footed or anything like that. But of course, that's 24% of goals. 20% of all the players, the left footers, score 70% of goals with their dominant left foot. This should mean 38% of all goals should be scored with the left foot. So remember earlier I said this counting how many goals were scored or not is nonsense. You just don't know what to make of it. And so just for fun, this is what you do when you're procrastinating from writing something else or preparing a lecture. I just picked an arbitrary tournament. I picked the World Cup 2010. And I picked up the top 25 goal scorers to say, well, are there more left footers than right footers? And the answer is no. So these are all the right footed guys in the top 25. Yeah, here they are. I had great fun making that slide, which serves zero purpose whatsoever, but it's a good slide. You may recognize these players. And here are the guys who I know use their left foot more than their right foot. 4 of 25, 16%. You know, so I said it should be 80-20, 84-16. I can live with that. So any kind of sampling you do will give you numbers that look like this, I suspect. Right, so fans believe two-footedness is important in elite football. I didn't show you that data. We've given questionnaire data to football fans. And fans tell you being two-footed is hugely important. I personally don't think it is at those sorts of levels in terms of outcome and skill and so on. Fans and pundits often think footedness is learned. You can become two-footed by practice. But if that's the case, it's not obvious in our data. I think they're half right or half wrong. You become more skilled with your so-called weak foot by practice. But yet there's a part of your brain that doesn't let you use it so much. Bits of your brain that choose which fits to use don't care that your non-preferred foot is really good. That's the way I'm thinking about these data. And I've learned all this by counting actions in football, and I got paid for doing it. Isn't that fun? So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your attention. Sorry, longer than I thought.
Okay, questions?
If anybody has to run off, by the way, feel free. Nothing. Yes, sir.
So one of your variables was accuracy for right footedness from left footedness in terms of the players that you measured. Do you think if you had the ability to measure reaction time and response time, that might differentiate your players?
Well, we don't really have, so the question is, we don't have accuracy in a sense, we have outcome, right? We have a sort of success fail rate. So, you know, what if we looked at other things like how quickly they use that foot, how quickly they react, and so on? Hard to say. I mean, again, my suspicion at the elite level, the differences would probably be there. They probably would favor the favorite foot, but they wouldn't be as dramatic as you'd hope. So even before I started collecting these sorts of data some years ago, people were looking at things like peak torque on a Cybex machine for amateur players, looking at their preferred and non-preferred leg. Or peak velocity. You can use a Doppler radar gun and have an amateur come into your lab and absolutely hammer the ball, and you measure the ball speed. And what you get in those kinds of studies are the sorts of things you get when you look at hand skill. If I have you tap as fast as you can with your right hand or your left hand, you'll be 5% faster with your right hand, your dominant hand. That's what these guys are in terms of skill measured that way. You know, how hard can you kick a ball, or what kind of peak torque can you get on a Cybex machine? I mean, it's a difference, but it's not huge. And the peak torque one is even kind of funny, because of course for kicking, you're doing some pretty impressive strength and balance things on your non-preferred foot when you're kicking. I think there are all kinds of other ways you could look for subtle differences between the 2 feet. But would they be big enough that I think they'd account for a 20, 25%, 30% bias towards one foot? I'd be surprised. One thing is clear, and I have data on some amateurs, but not enough, is that you have practiced with your preferred foot your whole life. In fact, if I had to guess, if I followed around your little boy kicking the ball around once he plays, right, not just kicking the ball in the back garden, then he'd be kicking the ball about 75% of the time with his favorite foot. So if he does that from when he's 4 to when he's 20, till he's 24, he's spent a lot of time kicking the ball with his favorite foot. So there should be some differences that are measurable, I'm sure. I'm just not sure what they'll be. Ralph?
You said at the end about it may be better to use footedness rather than handedness in terms of the work that you're doing, trying to come up with alternatives to understand kind of one-less style tests for naturality. So why was that? Why would it potentially have more sense?
The question here is, I made a comment earlier in the talk about, instead of recruiting participants for our other studies about cerebral asymmetry in Bangor, you often recruit more lefties than you get by chance because you'll have rare atypical individuals in them. Maybe I'd be smarter to recruit left-footed players. Well, think back to that dichotic listening data I showed you. In our data and 2 other samples, if you're looking for people who are right brain dominant, proxy for that is being left-eared on dichotic listening. Yeah, I mean, it's a little more complicated than this. If more of those people are in the left-footed group than in the than in the left-handed group, then that's a better recruitment tool. Now, of course, if I advertise for left-footed people, do you kick a ball with your left foot? Come to our lab and we'll pay you £6 to do some tests. I'll get mostly left-handers. Yeah, but they're left-handers who are left-handed and then footed, so that's one issue. They're congruent. And then the right-handers I get again maybe. Another type of thing we're doing is we're going to compare with a lot of our measures. So we have measures on hand skill differences. We have measures on indirect tests like dichotic listening. We have measures on indirect tests like tachistoscopic presentations of faces, right? Where people with conventional dominance, who are left dominant for speech and language, usually, not always, we don't know how often, are right dominant for face perception, right? So you should perform a little bit better than the left visual field on a face recognition task, for example. We're looking at people who have congruent side biases, right? So there are a proportion of left-handers who are also left-footed, who are also left-eyed. If these things are all weakly related to cerebral dominance, then you'll find more people with atypical dominance in a group of left people. Who are my left lady? No, left eye? Let's check. Watch me. I'm looking at your nose. Yeah, I hold both hands up like this. I don't look at my hands, I don't close one eye. I bring my hands together so I'm looking at your nose through a little slot between my fingers. Can you see that? Yeah. Okay, wait, for our studio audience at home. Bet nobody's done that to the camera. There, you do that to me. Hands up, look at my nose. Don't look at your hands. Okay, hands together. He's right-eyed. What a shame. We know you. I can't remember what you are. Left. Dan is going to be interesting. We're desperate. We're desperate for Dr. Roberts, one of your star lecturers, to come back to visit us to Bangor so we can get his head into the fMRI machine and see what's really happening in there. We bet it's very impressive, whatever it is. That wasn't an answer to your question, I suppose. Get in there. Yeah.
Any other questions?
It's a random question. So if you were asked to be a pundit at the next World Cup,
Can you imagine?
what would you say?
What would I say about footedness?
Yeah.
What would I say about footedness if I was a pundit at the next World Cup?
So
Well, I certainly would catch some of the attribution errors, and you don't hear them very often. But when commentators do comment on preferred and non-preferred foot, they do it because of an unusual instance. And they're skewed in the way they do that. So, like I said, when Ryan Giggs kicks the ball over the bar with his good foot, you don't say that's because he used his good foot. Right? So that would probably be my minimal contribution, besides criticizing Frank Ribery, who's rubbish. Why do we pay that guy so much money? And I would talk about the Arsenal's midfield and their lack of a spine, because I'm a football fan too. I don't know anything about football. Anything else?
Okay.
No, thank you very much.
Thanks.